All right, we're going to just snap that together. All right. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're a proud member of the Dialogue Podcast Network, and you know who else is? Beyond the Block seeks to center the narratives of the marginalized in conversations on Mormonism. A Black lifelong member and queer theologian, Brother Jones and Brother Knox seek to fill the gaps between Mormon theology and Mormon culture, that people of all identities may claim a seat at the table of Christ. We're concluding our conversation with historian Don Bradley. In our final conversation, Don will address critics who call him an apologist for his too rosy picture of the lost pages of the Book of Mormon. We'll also talk about what really can be known. So this is going to be a fun conversation. You won't want to miss it. Also, at the end of our video, I'm going to be giving away this copy of Don's book that's been autographed by him as well, as you can see right here. So one of you is going to become a lucky owner of the Lost 116 Pages book. So stay tuned at the end for that. Now back to our conversation. All right, well, I want to wrap up with one last question.
Sure.
This is rare for me in that because I got to interview you kind of back to back, that I've actually had a little bit of feedback.
Oh.
And so some of the feedback that I get from, I guess, non-believers, is that there are some people that just flat out believe the Book of Mormon is fiction.
Sure.
And so they don't like you taking the Book of Mormon seriously. And the argument is there's no Laban, there's no Nephi, there were no golden plates. And I guess my response is that doesn't matter, because whether those are true or not, there are still lost pages.
Right.
And so it's interesting to me to say, well, what would have been on the lost pages? So this stuff about the Liahona and priesthood and Masonic implements that we talked about last time and things like that, I still find fascinating. But yet there are some people who are going to say, well, Don Bradley is just an apologist. So how would you respond to those sorts of people who seem to conflate this idea, well, I think the Book of Mormon's crap, and so Don's just an apologist for the church. So how would you respond to those?
Oh, I mean, the question would be where to start. For one thing, I would point out that they may not be aware of my personal history when it comes to these subjects, that actually I started this project. When I started this project, I was in the church, but I was very much a doubter. I wasn't coming from a place of belief. So subsequently I came to be completely disillusioned for several years, left the church officially, right, had my name removed from the church records, was out of the church for 5 years before returning. And so the thing is, I've continued this project in basically the same kind of way the entire time, right? So it's not, if they're thinking that it's a question that the question of what was in the lost pages is somehow uniquely tied to a worldview perspective, they're mistaken. My worldview has changed dramatically across the course of doing this project, but the project itself has continued, and the findings that I made while I was out of the church about what was in the lost pages still hold water for me. I didn't change my mind about those or anything, right? And so part of the reason why it's possible in the first place to do that, right, to shift worldviews but continue the same historical project, is that the project isn't about ancient Nephites in Mesoamerica. I'm not doing faith-based archaeology or something looking for Zarahemla, right? I'm trying to figure out, as you were indicating, I'm trying to figure out what was in a certain lost manuscript. Now, while it's controversial whether there were Nephites, it's not controversial that there was an initial Book of Mormon manuscript that got stolen. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out what was in that manuscript. So for that question, it's really irrelevant whether one thinks there were Nephites or not. It's irrelevant for that question, whether there were Nephites or not. It may be very important for other issues, but it's not important for knowing what was in the lost pages. And so, one could, suppose that we found a fragment of a manuscript of a Shakespeare play that we didn't know about. We found a partial manuscript, and then scholars analyzed the patterns of Shakespeare's known plays and analyzed and how he tends to structure his plots and so on, and then looked at this play and tried to tease out the clues in it. Let's say we had the last half of it. They could try to tease out the clues for what was in the first half, right? There doesn't need to be any assumption that the play is historical, right? That the play was about real people or something. The play could be entirely fictional, and it would still be interesting to try to figure out what was in it. And so similarly, an analogy, so something else that some people aware of my book may not know is that this book is building on my master's thesis. And my master's thesis had both Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint committee members on it. They didn't have none of them, Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint, had a problem with my methodology. They didn't think I was making faith assumptions, because I wasn't, and I laid out my methodology. This master's thesis is available online. It's called American Proto-Zionism in the Book of Lehi, Recontextualizing the Rise of Mormonism, and people could Google that and find it in PDF and look at the methodology and everything. But my committee members, passed my thesis with no changes, which they said was basically unheard of. And one of them told another scholar that he wished they could give me a doctorate for it because it was really a dissertation. So if people are assuming that this is a work of apologetics and not really an academic scholarly work, they're mistaken, right? And an analogy that I make in the intro to the thesis about when I'm talking about the methodology, and that I believe I also put in the intro to the book, is an analogy to biblical textual criticism. So textual critics, they do something that's in some ways similar to the work that I'm doing here. They try to reconstruct the earliest version of a text. Sometimes they even do that with lost texts, like the Q source that stands behind Matthew and Luke in the New Testament. There are certain controversies in textual criticism of the Bible. There are controversies about what the earliest form of a manuscript was. So let's take the Gospel of Mark. So the Gospel of Mark actually ends with a resurrection story, but the resurrection story in the earliest manuscripts of Mark is a much more abbreviated resurrection story, where basically the women show up at the tomb and the angel tells them, he's not here, he's gone, tell the disciples he's going to meet them in Galilee. And then if you look at our current version of Mark, it's actually, the ending is much more extensive. It has a brief account of the apostles directly encountering the risen Christ, which other gospels have. But the earliest version of Mark appears to have not had that. So you could take one textual critic who is, a Pentecostal Bible scholar, right? And there are serious Bible scholars of all different denominations, right? So you could have a Pentecostal textual critic, and you could have an atheist, secular humanist textual critic, both studying the Gospel of Mark and its resurrection narrative, and they should be able to agree on what the earliest ending of Mark was. It's not a faith question. It's a historical, empirical question to be solved by the methods of textual criticism. And so the Pentecostal Bible scholar is, of course, going to believe there was actually a resurrection. right? Like Jesus actually rose from the dead, and this is a historical account that's telling us what happened, right, about this resurrection. And the atheist, he might not even believe Jesus actually existed as a historical figure, certainly wouldn't believe he rose from the dead, but those two should be able to agree methodologically on how to answer this question. So in the same way, because what textual criticism aims to get at is it's not trying to get at the realities behind the text. It's not trying to get at the actual events, whatever those were, right? It's trying to get at the text. What was in this earliest version of the text? So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to get, in this work, I'm not trying to get behind the text, right? So if I talk about Nephi, if I talk about Laban, right? If I talk about Mosiah the First, any of these figures, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to go beyond what the lost manuscript said. I'm just trying to find out what the lost manuscript said, and then readers will have a host of different views about the historical reality of, were these historical figures? Was the text completely historical, or was it a modern expansion on an ancient historical source? Was it completely fictional? Was it fiction written by Joseph Smith? Was it fiction written by Solomon Spaulding or somebody else?
Even if you say it's fiction, something was written down.
Right. Whether readers view it as fiction or as history, there was a text. There was a narrative. I'm trying to piece together what that narrative was. Now, it may be good for readers to know that I do explain this in the intro to the book, but I am writing as a Latter-day Saint, right? And recognizing that most of my readers are also going to be Latter-day Saints. So I employ the language, our shared language of faith. I talk about Joseph Smith translating the text, whereas I could just say he claimed to translate or he dictated, right? I use the word translate. I talk about all of these things as if they happened, as things that happened, right? But I don't methodologically assume an ancient context for the narrative, right? Just like a textual critic approaching the ending of the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't matter whether they believe Jesus rose from the dead. That's not what's at issue here. What's at issue is, what are the clues about what was in this earliest narrative about Jesus' resurrection? So I'm trying to get at that narrative. Now, the idea of being an apologist, it's unfortunate that I would hope and think that it's clear from what I just laid out that the approach that I'm taking is not apologetic, it's scholarly, because I just want to know what was in that manuscript, right? But to kind of put a finer point on that, I think it's incredibly unfortunate that people are divided so strongly into these different camps, right? And they each have this really pretty dark and negative view of the other. It's like Republicans and Democrats, right, in our modern society, And so believers and former believers, they identify each other as apologists and critics, right? And these are both meant to be pejorative terms. They're not meant to be neutral, descriptive terms, but not every time that someone is speaking as a believer are they acting as an apologist, and not every time that someone is speaking as a non-believer are they acting as a critic, right? Those are fighting words. Those are ways of debating somebody.
I think critic is actually a nice word, because most people just say anti-Mormon.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, I've talked with Sandra Tanner, I've talked with Dan Vogel. They don't like to be called an anti-Mormon, but they happily claim the term critic.
Yeah. I do think you're right that it's a better word, but there are some people who are trying to act as critics, and there are some people who are not. They're simply speaking as non-believers. I don't consider everyone who's not a believer who says something about Mormonism from their non-believing perspective to be a critic. So let me give an example. Maybe I'm speaking in part from the fact that I was an ex-Mormon for 5 years, right? And I didn't like being labeled a critic simply because I didn't believe, right? Now, there were times when I did act as a critic. I especially critiqued apologetics, right? And occasionally faith claims, mostly apologetics. But critics seem to me a way of trying to dismiss someone, right?
Just like apologetics.
Just like apologist is used to dismiss people. So the example that I remember coming up with is, suppose that there's a historian over in China, modern day China, right, he's been raised all his life, communist, atheist, right, like not really familiar with religion, has never believed in religion, never encountered really, has a basic knowledge of what Christians believe, but has never been a religious person. And he finds out about early Mormonism, and he's just fascinated, right? And he starts studying early Mormonism, and he writes a history in Chinese for, people in China, introducing them to the history of Mormonism, but of course telling the narrative from a non-believing perspective because he's a non-believer, he's got a naturalistic paradigm. Would that person who's just interested in the origins of Mormonism from his own worldview, but has no animus whatsoever against Mormonism, be a critic? That would be a preposterous thing to say. Those are just debate words. Those are polemical words. They're not describing anything there that would be real.
Well, and I do know that in some cases, Reza Aslan is a Muslim scholar that has written on Christianity, and some people write him off right off the bat because he's Muslim.
Right.
So, I mean, this happens not just in the Mormon world, but it happens in every context.
Right, for sure. So when I was outside the church, I was labeled a critic. When I came back to the church, some of my former fellow ex-Mormon conversation partners on the internet immediately started labeling me an apologist, right? Now, sure, if critic means non-believer and apologist means believer, sure, but I don't think that's what those words mean. Why don't we just call people, why do we need to add something on top of mere descriptive terms for where people are at, right? So the term apologist also gets me in particular wrong because it shows that people don't understand my motivations. So my motivations, my fundamental motivations when it comes to digging into Mormon history have not changed from the time that I was doing the church history research that led me out of the church to the time that I was doing the church history research that led me back into the church to the church history research that I've done since I've been back in the church. What I want is to understand what happened. Period. I just want to know what happened, right? And so if I make findings sometimes, which I have at times, that help to resolve certain difficult questions in Mormon history, like my work on the Kinderhook plates, that can be used apologetically, right? But if so, it's accidental apologetics on my part, because I wasn't setting out to be an apologist. I made a lot of those findings while I was an ex-Mormon atheist. So doing Mormon apologetics was the last thing on my mind, right? I wasn't trying to be an apologist. Historical information can have apologetic uses, it can have critical uses. It doesn't necessarily mean that the motivations behind digging and finding out what happened are apologetic or critical. So a part of how this really gets me wrong is, I should make a caveat before I say this. There's nothing inherently wrong with apologetics, and there's nothing inherently wrong with criticism, right? So apologetics just means defending a viewpoint. So an ex-Mormon who is trying to lay out to their family why they left the church and defend their decision to leave the church is in that context acting as an apologist for their own non-belief. Apologist and critic, we use them pejoratively, but fundamentally they're just descriptive terms. They're not necessarily positive or negative, right? There were apologists for the civil rights movement. There were apologists for gay marriage. There were apologists for, maintaining laws against gay marriage, right? There are critics of all these positions. They're neutral. They're inherently neutral terms, but we tend to use them pejoratively, right, in this context. So there's nothing inherently wrong with defending one's point of view, but that's not really who I am. That's not what motivates me. Apologetics, from my perspective, is about defending what you think you already know, and that sounds horrifyingly boring to me, because I don't want to defend what I think I already know. I want to figure out what I don't already know. And so that's not apologetics, that's inquiry. That's what I want. That's what I'm about. That's what I'm doing here. This book, started out initially as kind of a massive curiosity question, right? There's certainly, like I said, I was a doubter at the time that I started the project. This wasn't about apologetics. This is about finding out what happened, finding out what was in that manuscript, and then that has all kinds. It turns out that what was in that manuscript has all kinds of implications for understanding the Book of Mormon as a whole, right? Because it provides a much larger context for the rest of the Book of Mormon narrative. It provides a much fuller narrative of what the small plates gives us just very skeletally, right? It provides. The lost manuscript of the Book of Mormon was the earliest Mormon scripture. It preceded the text that we have. It preceded the earliest section in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 3. It's the earliest scripture of Mormonism. And so if we want to understand early Mormonism, we really need to understand what was in that manuscript. So this is the kind of thing that I want to know. This is what I've been working to figure out. So that's what I'm about.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Don Bradley. Do you have any last comments you want to share with us or anything?
Yeah, I think I would say that, this lost manuscript has been gone for nearly 2 centuries. And I think that, and it's kind of shocking when you consider that, and that it was the earliest Mormon scripture, and that it's a substantial part of the foundational book of the Latter-day Saint Church, right? I think that it's really shocking that more work has not been done on this sooner, and it's maybe seeing the fact that we can piece together things, we can start to answer a mystery that's been there for so long, maybe should make us optimistic about what other questions in Mormon history we can tackle. I think the biggest limitation that we have in doing Mormon history is that we think that certain questions can't be solved empirically. We think there are things we can't figure out. Well, I'm an optimist, right? Mm-hmm. You have to be kind of a crazy optimist to try to do this kind of project. But it's worked out, And I think that I would love to see more people tackling various questions of Mormon history that maybe we've assumed could kind of never be answered, right? And I think that's one implication of research like this, is just that that can be done, right? And I'd love to see other people take things that are in this book and kind of further explore some of the same questions. It doesn't, certainly there's a lot of information to master, but this is not a technical field, right, where you need several years of advanced training in mathematics or arcane languages or whatever to dive in. And so if people are curious about this subject or other subjects in Mormon history, I would invite them to just kind of do what I did, right? And just dive in and engage these questions, and let's see what happens. And scholarship is a conversation, right? Ultimately, it's not just something that one person does. And so I would love to see other people. I'd love to engage with others as they dig and see what we can all figure out.
Well, that's awesome. Well, Don Bradley, thanks. And your book is just awesome. I'm just going to encourage everybody, whether you're a believer or a skeptic, go buy his book. It's a fantastic book. And oh, by the way, I'm actually going to give away a copy.
Cool.
And I'm going to have you autograph it so
cool.
that so that you'll be able to get someone out there is going to get an autographed copy from Don. So
cool.
Well, thanks again, Don. I really appreciate you
Thank
being here on Gospel Tangents. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with historian Don Bradley. I learned a lot, and I have to tell you, this is a really awesome book. And I'm about to give this very book away. So, without further ado, these are all the people that are entered in my newsletter that are eligible for this. So here we go. Shake, shake, shake. And here we go. I'll close my eyes, and the name that I pick out is Todd Bliss from Utah. Now I think that's, I have to tell you, I did a test thing one time and I put my name in there and it said I was from New Jersey, so you can't trust this. But I believe Todd Bliss lives in Utah, and so Todd, please contact me at gospeltangents@gmail.com and tell me how to mail this to you. So congratulations, Todd. It's an awesome book, and if you didn't win, you should go buy it because it's fantastic. In our next conversation, I'm excited to introduce University of Utah classics professor, Dr. Margaret Toscano. She tells a very interesting story about how she learned Latin.
And I had a boyfriend who I met in a history class, and he persuaded me to take Latin, and I did. Well, that boyfriend is long since gone, but Latin lasts forever. I still teach Latin. I love teaching. I teach both Latin and ancient Greek and all kinds of courses dealing with religious topics and literary and cultural topics. I teach a big introductory to classical mythology. Sometimes I'll have 250 students.
Wow. If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please support Gospel Tangents and become a subscriber. For just $5 a month, go to patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire interview. And you can also get transcripts available at either our Amazon website, or if you want to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website at gospeltangents.com and you can click the yellow subscribe button. Of course, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other places. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And don't forget to click here to subscribe on YouTube, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again for listening.